Welcome everyone. This is part 2 of the week 3 lecture on augmented feedback, and this section is on teaching skills, on whether or not we teach the skills in either whole or part practice. So one of the things we try to look at when we're teaching skills is whether or not we should break a skill down in its parts to teach it, or whether it's actually better off to teach it in its whole. Because sometimes if we try to break a skill down in its parts, we could actually disrupt the synergies of the skill and actually make it more mechanical than it needs to be, and that's not necessarily conducive to the optimal learning environment which we're trying to create. So in this first slide here on whole and part practice, I've just got a bit of a funny YouTube clip there, as I like to put things in. It's a dance routine from one of the episodes on The Office, which is one of my sort of favourite series. My wife can't watch it because she finds it just too hard to watch, but I find it was one of the funniest things. I'm a big fan of David Brent. You probably show my age there, but if you ever get to watch something, click on that and have a look at it and see if you find it as funny as I do. But let's get into the material for what you're here for. This is what we're looking at today in relation to teaching skills, whether or not we should break it in its parts or whether we should teach them as its whole. And so if we skip to the third slide, which is entitled Skill Complexity and Organisation. Now, previously, you might have heard the term skill or task complexity, and you may have sort of referred that to how difficult a skill is, and that would be right. But in this situation here, skill or task complexity refers to the amount of components or parts there are. So it's not necessarily on how difficult it is to perform, but how many parts it actually has. So if you look at this slide here, there's a few examples down the bottom there, a few pictures. One of them is from Craig Buster Mottram. So he's trying to qualify for the Olympic Games in the marathon. He used to be a 5-10K runner. Awesome, was known as the White Kenyan because he was one of the first non-African Americans to be able to compete at the 5K, 1500 at World Championships and cross-country level and compete with the Africans. So he was nicknamed the White Kenyan from a lot of the African runners. Again, useless information, but I'm a bit of a fan of Buster Mottram, so that's why he's there. So for the skill of running, we would say that there's not a lot of components. You move your arms, you move your legs. There's not a lot of parts to it, so we would say that's low in task complexity. If we go to another favourite of mine, as you know, even though it's only been a couple of weeks, you know I love the golf swing. So with the golf swing, we would say that's high in task complexity because it has a lot of components to it. Same thing with the skill of cycling, there's not a lot of parts to the skill, so we would say again that's low in task complexity. Doesn't mean it's not hard to do, just means there's not a lot of different individual parts. Alright? If we go to the next slide, we look at skill complexity and organisation. So now we look at how the skills are organised. So if we look at the skill of walking, we would say, okay, there's not a lot of parts to it, but the way the parts are related are really close. They have close what they call synergies or coordinative structures. So when we walk and run, our legs and arms are almost subconsciously linked. We don't even think about it, but they move at a certain ratio of each other that we wouldn't even know. They just do it automatically. So we say in the skill of walking that if the parts are closely linked, so we would say that they're high in organisation. Whereas a dance routine, we would say that you could practice one part of a dance routine, stop, then go to another part of the dance routine, practice the two of them at different times, and then put the two together, and that wouldn't necessarily disrupt the flow of the whole skill. It's hard to do the whole dance routine because you forget what the start is anyway, so you need to actually break it up into its parts. So we would say a dance routine would be low in organisation. So if you look at these two skills on this slide here, we would say walking is low in complexity, high in organisation, and therefore we should teach it as whole practice. Whereas a dance routine, we would say it is high in task complexity, low in organisation, and therefore we should teach it into part practice. So that's really what the next slide is about there. It's just that decision whether or not to break into its parts or teach it its whole. So we've sort of answered that bit there. But if we go to the slide after that, we get a little table there, which is on task complexity and organisation. And I guess the bit of the difference here is what happens when they're either both low or they're both high. So if something is high in complexity and high in organisation, we're better off still breaking it up into its parts because it means it's quite contextual, it's quite cognitive. And if we look at in this slide here, The skill that's high in both is executing a jump serve in volleyball. Now that's a very complex skill because there's a number of different parts, but the parts are really closely related, the way you jump and into it. So it's a bit of a tricky one, but we could break that up into its parts. In other words, we could teach people how to run and jump the way volleyball people do, rather than just running and jump normal. It's a different skill set. And we could teach you how to actually practice serving with the volleyball, and then we can put the two together. So a safe bet would say if they're both high in organisation and complexity, break it up into its parts. On the other hand, if something is low in both, like clapping the hands, well, it sounds really silly, but you teach whole practice. You wouldn't be teaching someone to go, right, clapping, we're going to go this hand first, then this hand, and we're going to bring it together. You just do it. Right? So it sounds really silly, but that table there gives you a good indication. If it's one or the other, choose whole or part based on the definitions that I gave above. If they're the same, or if they're high in both, we go break into its parts, or if they're low in both, we would teach it its whole. So again, too, that just gives you a real general idea of if you're not sure how to instruct the skill at the start, whether or not you should teach it its whole, or whether or not you should break it up its parts, this gives you a good indication of how you might go about doing that, okay? Again, too, there's no necessarily 100% right or wrong, but this is what the literature and the theory tells us works really best. In the field, I found this is what does actually work really well, these theories. So there might be a lot of you that are either swimming coaches or tennis coaches, whatever it might be, and you might have some different ideas about how you think it might be taught. But what we're going to find in the slides that are coming up too, when we do break a skill down to its parts, we have different ways of actually doing that, and we're going to define those as well. But just before we go into that, another way to look at whether or not we teach skills in its parts or wholes is we can look at the number of motor programs. Now, these next couple of slides won't be in an exam. I'm just putting them as another way of looking at it, is if we look at the number of motor programs, in other words, if there's more than one thing that you need to do, in other words, in relation to a tennis serve, we need to throw and catch as well as we need to then hit at the same time. So if there's more than one motor program, I sort of say, look, probably best off breaking it up into its parts. Whereas, if it's one motor program like kicking or throwing or catching, again, you're probably better off teaching its whole. You don't want to be sort of breaking the skill down like catching or throwing and going, right, do this bit first and then do the follow through next. It just stops the synergy, it stops the flow of the movement. So if there's one motor program, whether it's throwing or kicking or catching or hitting, just teach them its whole. Let them do it, let them flow through, let them make mistakes, let them do it. But if it's a bit more complex, there's more than one component to it, more than one motor program, then break it up into its parts. All right. So again, I'll refer to that term complexity, in this situation, number of tasks. All right. So the next slide here just looks at a couple of examples I normally do in class, not playing the piano, but writing with one arm and writing with the other, and it's called a bimanual coordination task, but you'll focus a bit more on that on the labs in the next coming week. So I won't go through that particular slide in today's lab. Now the next thing on lead-up activities, again too, I'm not going to go through that just now because again we'll go through that a little bit more in the lectures. In the tutes in the coming weeks. So I'm going to forward to now to the slide which is entitled Various Part Task Training Approaches. So now we're assuming that we're going to focus a bit more on part practice, and if we're going to focus a bit more on part practice, are there different methods of breaking a skill up into its parts? What are their definitions and how do they work? So again, these are the theories of motor control, that motor learning, I should say, theories of motor learning that I'm expecting you to be able to implement in your assignments. So I'm expecting you to use the words like task complexity, task organisation, and these words on this slide: simplification, segmentation, and fractionalisation when appropriate. So that's what I mean about using motor learning principles or concepts in the marking rubric. It's using these words that we're talking about this week. So we're talking about feedback, faded feedback, bandwidth feedback, terminal, concurrent, KR, KP, qualitative, quantitative analysis. These terms we're actually expecting you to actually intertwine into your assignments and your videos and actually use the language that we're giving you, because that shows me that you've actually tried to integrate the motor learning principles, and that's one of the key concepts of how we grade this assessment task. So it's really important that you try to understand this language and try to use it in your videos, because that's great, I guess, it's great, it's not feedback, it's great reviewing for your exam as well. So it's really important. They're new terms, you won't have heard of them, obviously, because they're new, tautology at its best, But anyway, you need to try to start using them in order to try to understand them, okay? So these are three terms that are related in somewhat to part practice. They're simplification, segmentation, and fractionalisation. All right, so let's start with fractionalisation. So if we're going to teach someone a bimanual task, so here we've got tennis serve, swimming, playing an instrument. So a bimanual task refers to bimanual skills in which one practices something different than the other. So things like a tennis serve, right? Both arms are doing something different at once. Things like the piano, you might be doing bass, treble, you're doing it. So the arms are doing different things. Playing the drums, love to be able to play the drums. I've got no rhythm in me whatsoever, unfortunately. But to be able to do something with your hands, something other with this hand and your foot, it amazes me. I don't know how they do it, but it's amazing. But really, this is where fractionalisation comes into play. So practice should begin with the hand or the limb that has the most difficult task first. And that's up to the coach to decide which is which. So that's why a lot of times too, people with the tennis serve, they practice actually throwing the ball up first. Because that's actually harder than hitting. Because throwing the ball up with a non-dominant hand up and keeping your arms still and keeping it up at the same spot is actually a really difficult task. Whereas hitting the ball, it's still hard at first, but you can sort of get better at that quicker as you can compared to when you're throwing the ball up in the air. So, for the tennis serve, that's an example of a bimanual skill for you examined for your STP, Skills Training Project. So if we use the tennis serve, for example, it's a bimanual skill. We could use the fractionalisation approach, which means we need to practice the hardest limb first, which would be the ball toss. So we practice the ball toss first. Then we practice hitting, so trying to hit the ball, and then we put the two together, and that is called fractionalisation for bimanual skills. Really important you understand that, especially if your skill is a bimanual task. The next one we go to is for skills that aren't bimanual, that have a bit more of a linkage, so like a gymnastics routine, a dance routine. They're the skills that we've spoken about before that are definitely related to what's called the segmentation approach. So just think about different segments. So like I said, dance routine, gymnastics routine, it might be a set play move in a team sport, whatever it might be, it's a series of events, if you like, almost like a series of discrete movements. So here in the dance routine, you might have part A, which you would learn first, then you'd learn part B, and then you put A and B together. Then you can learn part C, and then you put A, B, and C together. So that's the example of a progressive part practice, which is the segmentation approach. All right. So that's two different approaches: fractionalisation for bimanual, and segmentation for skills that, like I said, have segments or parts to it. Now the last one is what we call the simplification approach. Now simplification is a form of part practice, a little bit of a weird one to say because you're actually still doing the skill as a whole. But what we say when we use the word part practice for simplification, we mean focusing on one aspect of the skill or simplifying it to make it easier. So on the slide here, the simplification approach, on the left-hand side, we've got a term there which says reducing the difficulty of the task. So a classic example of that with kids' sport is T-ball. So if they're trying to learn softball or baseball, it's not going to be much fun out in the field because they're going to keep missing it. If you get kids to pitch it to them all the time, they keep missing it. No one's going to have any fun because no one's going to hit the ball. So they start with T-ball, kids give it a whack, some of them still miss it as we know, but most of them connect the ball, then they run, off they go and they do it and have fun and cheer and all that kind of stuff and get involved. But that's an example of simplification. You're reducing the difficulty of the task. So T-ball is a classic example of that. All right. Another thing it can do as well is look at things that you can add to make the task easier, whether or not be music or rhythm. That's another way of where it says here it can be physical or auditory. So you could add music to someone or to something to provide the rhythm to help them with something. So that's sort of simplifying the movement as well. Or anything you can do to reduce the potential demands of the task. So for the tennis serve, rather than them having to go up and throw it up and hit it, you throw them the ball and they hit it. Again, you're just reducing the difficulty of it. So there are three main methods that we look at in order to implement a part practice teaching approach. All right. Now, the last thing I'm going to put up here is that slow motion practice. Because a lot of times people love slow motion practice, and some people think it can be benefit, especially early on in practice, because it reduces error, provides a more effective control. But, the reality is we don't want to disrupt the way a skill is being performed too much in relation to its rhythm and its speed, because that's the way that the neuromuscular system is trying to adapt. It's trying to release the degrees of freedom and work in synergies. So really, I would advocate against slow motion practice. There's probably examples where you could use it, but I would prefer to do it at its whole. You can use observational learning in slow motion if you want to focus on something specifically, but even then I would prefer to show something or demonstrate it in real time, let them see it, let them try to sort of problem solve it. So I wouldn't break it up into slow motion practice too much. The next sort of slide there is looking also to error detection practice as well, but again too, I wouldn't be focusing on too much on that there. So really guys, the last couple of slides there just summarise what we're looking at, but what I've just summarised in this video are the real key aspects for your skill training project, how to use the language that we're saying today into your assignment, the specific information that's going to be on your exam as well is what we sort of focused on today. So that's sort of a bit of a summary of that particular information. So again, any questions, email, call me, any examples that you need, any clarification on the information, feel free to come and chat to me anytime at all. And just to let you know, in the next day, there'll be a video as well for week 4 lecture as well. So thanks for listening and good luck with it all, and we'll see you soon. Okay, cheers.